náš hlavní speaker tohoto dopoledne. Člověk více než kompetentní na právě tohle téma, na téma otevřených dat, pan Andrew Stott. Pan Andrew Stott, abych vám o něm něco krátce řekla, než dorazí sem, je poradcem britské vlády pro transparentnost a byl prvním ředitelem sekce pro digitální služby na britském úřadu vlády. Takže patřil mezi ty, kdo opravdu hodně přispěli k tomu, aby se otevírala v Británii ta vládní data a aby vznikl portál Data.gov.uk. Po volbách v roce 2010 jste si možná už taky přečetli, že byl to právě on, kdo měl na starosti vlastně implementaci těch všech politik na centrální i místní úrovni a staral se o to, aby britská vláda co nejlépe komunikovala právě v tom prostředí internetu, sociálních sítí a tak dále. Po odchodu do penze nesedí někde jenom na zahrádce a nepije čaj, ale je dál aktivní, to znamená, že se věnuje této problematice i nadále a působí jako konzultant Světové banky, je členem poradních sborů Open Knowledge Foundation a dalších institucí, které se tím zabývají. Jinak, co se týče jeho akademického backgroundu, tak je matematik a právník, vystudovaný na univerzitě v Cambridge. Mr. Stott, the floor is yours. Good morning.
Great. Good morning, everyone. It's an honour to be here. You've got a very distinguished set of speakers today. Indeed, I think this is the first time that the three key people who implemented data.gov.uk and started the open data work in the UK have been in the same room. So there's the danger of sort of explosion or something. That's Richard Sterling now with the Open Data Institute and Eleanor Stewart now with the Foreign Office and transparency in British diplomacy. And we've got a number of other distinguished speakers. Chris Taggart from Open Corporates, who I've worked with on open data over the last 4 years as a big user of open data, and Richard Swetnam from the European Commission, who has been leading the work by the European Commission to push open data across Europe. So a lot to get through. And I thought in this sort of introductory talk, I'd give a survey of what open data is about, those emerging policy dimensions, and give you some examples of that. Mainly from the UK, because those are the examples I know best, and I can sort of check out that they're real, easier in the UK than in some other places. But there's some other good examples elsewhere that I'll draw on, and draw some lessons about what makes for success in open data, and how to push that forward. So first, what's the idea of open data? And in the UK, it really started with a proposition which read a bit like this. The government, as part of its normal business, collects a lot of data, and indeed it generates a lot of data. And it needs that data to take policy decisions, to improve public service operations, and in a sense, it collects that data precisely because it needs it. If it didn't need it, it wouldn't be collecting it. And that data is data about things that are interesting to people. It's about data about hospitals and medical services. It's data about schools, education. It's data about crime, policing, and justice. It's data about the environment. And there's a certain amount of data in there about politicians and about civil servants, about public servants as well, that people are interested in. And the thing about data is what the economists call non-rivalrous. You can use data, and then someone else can use the data. The data doesn't sort of wear out by being used, and if you're using it, it doesn't stop someone else using it. So the basic proposition was, just because the government have used the data for the purposes for which it was originally collected, doesn't mean that other people can't find other uses for that data and generate economic and social value. And indeed that may well be, and this has proved to be the case, uses of that data that not only the government wouldn't want to do itself, but the government couldn't even conceive of that use being made. And one of the things we've learned about data is data doesn't know what it's for. So you think you've collected the data for one purpose, and then it turns out to have another purpose as well. So open data is the proposition that it's about data. And we've tended to sort of narrow down on systematic, structured data that you can analyze and is in some way in a table or something. You know, it's not a novel or indeed a learned report from a government inspector. So it's data rather than information as a whole. That can be freely used. And that's free, as we say in English, both in the sense of free speech, in that you're allowed to do anything freely, you're not regulated against using it, and free in the sense of free beer, in the sense that you don't have to pay for it. And it's also, we've concentrated on data being available for reuse. It's not just access to information, it's the ability to take that information and use it for another purpose, repurpose it, process it again, including redistributing it. And so that goes beyond some of the provisions in, say, freedom of information law, which allow access to information, but don't necessarily, in a lot of freedom of information laws, don't actually give you a power to reuse that information. So, for instance, the Open Knowledge Foundation Germany have received a cease and desist notice from the German Minister of the Interior because they published a document that they were given under the Freedom of Information Act from the Ministry of the Interior. Under German FOI law, there is no actual right to reuse information you get under the Freedom of Information law. In the UK, we actually changed the Freedom of Information law, so if you get data, you do have a right to reuse it. And the policy objective, the policy objectives for open data, when you look at open data initiatives across the world, I suppose you see three main policy objectives. And in the UK, we've had all three of these, and depending on the political narrative of the time, one has been more important than others at a time. So sometimes it's transparency, sometimes it's economic growth, sometimes it's improving public services. But again, I say data doesn't know what it's for, so often you find these mixed together. And I suppose where we started in the UK, and this is a big feature of the European public sector information policy, is there's new economic and social value to be gained by using that data. The data can be used to provide information-rich services to businesses and to citizens. And examples of that, a small startup in the UK called Mastodon C, incubated by the Open Data Institute, which Richard Sterling will talk about later, took the anonymized prescription data of all the medical prescriptions written by all the doctors in the UK, applied big data techniques and the latest health knowledge to analyze the prescribing patterns, and found potential savings to the health service of £200 million a year on just one class of drugs, if the prescriptions were actually used generic drugs in line with the latest medical knowledge, and that this was scalable to savings in other therapies as well. In London, the transport operating company, Transport for London, were essentially ordered by the Mayor of London to release their data. Indeed, he announced that they were going to release their data when it's not clear they were totally aware that they were going to release their data. But they did it, and they've recently done an evaluation of their 3 years since they released their data. And it turns out there are now about 500 applications using about 25 data feeds that they provide. There are about 5,000 people engaged in, if you like, the application industry. They're not all developers. They're support people, marketing, and so on. But interestingly, they evaluated it as a transport investment. And transport investments are traditionally evaluated on the economic value of the time that's saved. And they found that they'd spent less than £1 million on the Open Data Initiative. Most of that was setting up more resilient servers because of the greater demand for data. And the time saved so far for the citizens and visitors to London is worth, in economic terms, £58 million. And indeed, month by month, this rate of return goes up because people are still saving time, but most of the investment is made. This is probably the most productive investment in transport ever made in the UK. And if I tell you that now it's 58 to 1 return on investment, the threshold for investment in transport is 1.4 to 1 in terms of return on investment. So this is much better than the average transport project. As I say, data doesn't know what it's for. In the UK, we published the spending item by item by each ministry and each municipal council every month as a transparency measure. And I'll show you a bit later why that was a transparency measure. A company called Spikes Cavell take that data, clean it up, and sell it as business intelligence to the suppliers to government. And they've made a business out of that. Because in that data, it's which agency is buying what goods from what supplier at what price. So it's led to a more transparent market in supply to government. And that's ultimately good for government as well, because more transparent markets are more efficient markets. In Denmark, we haven't completed this in the UK yet, which is why I have this slide, because I use it a lot to UK policy audiences. In Denmark, they opened up all their address data to make sure there was a single address register used by all the public services and open to the private sector to use as well. In Denmark, they had a very pressing public service problem that if your house was on fire and you phoned the fire service and told the fire service, hello, I've got a fire at 4 Chevening Road, it was by no means certain that the fire service would go to where the fire was, because the fire service had out-of-date address records. So Denmark set up a single open address register. For the first 5 years, they got a 22 to 1 return on investment for doing that in terms of the benefits to Denmark. And now it's in steady state. Year on year, they get a benefit of 70 to 1. In the UK, we've released roadworks data as open data, allowing logistics firms to know not only where the congestion on the roads is today, but where it will be tomorrow and next week and next month. And that's got a 28 to 1 return on investment. We're opening up the cadastral data, the land registry data, house price information, and this is used by firms such as Zoopla to provide free information services on the web, but it actually gives them a chance to market other services concerned with property, so estate agent, realtor, services, financial services, builders, and local services. Everyone has an interest in how much their house is worth and how much the neighbours paid for their house, and all that information is publicly available. The insurance industry are very interested in using mapping data and weather data to get much more accurate prediction of where floods may happen, and particularly to start modelling the extreme end of the risk. So flood insurance is typically based on claims history, but if you're trying to cover once in 100-year flood risks, then you're tending to be raising the premiums for the people who've just had their 1 in 100-year event and are going to be okay for the next 99 years, and don't have a visibility on those who haven't had a flood for 99 years but may flood next year. And the big case about in open data at the moment is a US case. 2 engineers from Google left Google in 2006 and set up a company now called Climate Corp. They took 3 sets of open data from the US government. From the US Department of Agriculture, they took 60 years of field-by-field data on crop yields. As if there are any farmers among you, you'll know most of the work of farmers is filling in forms for the government, and that's true in the United States as well. But they had field-by-field data on crop yields for 60 years. The US Department of Agriculture also had 14 terabytes of soil quality data and what type of soil. The US Weather Bureau also had detailed weather observations over several decades at over 1 million points in the continental United States. And Climate Corp crunched all this open data and provided advisory services to farmers on what crops will grow in this field and what yields might be expected and what the variability of the yield would be. And they've teamed with financial services firms to sell crop insurance, so you can insure that against your yield being lower than a certain figure, and they've got all the analytics to do that. Last autumn, they sold out to Monsanto, the agrochemicals and seed company, for $930 million cash. And the raw material of Climate Corp is openly available on the web for anyone to download. So any of you could go and download this data and set up your own Climate Corp. The value has come in using that, the skills of using that data to provide useful services to business. And as Richard's boss, Neelie Kroes, has said, data is the new gold. I think sometimes we think of it as the new oil, that it lubricates the economy as well as glistening. But it's the economic value that has driven the benefits, the case in Europe. There's a case for improving public services as well. So that's about the performance of individual schools. And in the UK, we publish a lot of data about the facilities available in schools, the budgets, and also the performance. And that's quite heavily used by parents. That data on performance of schools influences local house prices because parents want to live near where the good schools are, and it creates a pressure for improvement. In the health service, the ambassador mentioned heart surgery, where publishing data on the clinical performance of 240 cardiac surgeons in the UK has reduced the number of operative and post-operative deaths by 1,000 cases a year through having a stimulus for best practice. The government publish on the web and as downloadable data lots of detailed performance data on hospitals, individual hospitals. This slide is of the 3 hospitals closest to where my elderly mother lives. Green is basically good, and this is basically about infections and cleanliness. Green is good, and red is bad on this. So antibiotic-resistant infections and blood clots on the left-hand side there. And again, that produces consumer pressure for improvement. And performance of the local police and of the courts. And with some reluctance from some in the police service, the government insisted that data on individual crimes, including their location, was published every month, and it's available on the web. It's one of the most popular government websites. It has about 25 million visitors a year. About a third of the population are aware of it and have visited it at least once. It's very closely followed. It's actually being used to drive citizen engagement. So when you go to this website, you not only get a map showing the individual crimes in your area, but you also get a photograph of your local policeman, their local police Twitter feed if there is one, how to contact the police, and importantly, how you can get involved in setting local policing priorities. And this was part of the policy objective, which was to get citizens more, really re-engaged in policing. Police have become remote and were not necessarily responding to local priorities for crime fighting. It's also led to some improvements in data within the wider criminal justice system, because prior to this site going live, nobody really knew if there was an individual crime, whether anyone had been arrested, whether anyone had been prosecuted, whether anyone had been convicted, or whether anyone had been sentenced. Because the police did one bit of it, and the prosecutors did another bit of it, the courts did another bit of it, and the prison service did another bit of it. And it turned out there had been £1.6 billion spent on coordinating IT in the criminal justice system, and it had not solved this problem. By putting this information out on the web and getting that pressure to, well, there was a crime, so was anyone arrested, and so on and so on. We're now starting to join up that data across government. And the third objective, traditionally of open data, is more transparent government. That's classically data about budgets and expenditure. And one of the early initiatives was an initiative from Open Spending and the Open Knowledge Foundation, where does my money go? So the government has spent so much money, what's it spent on? And making that information much more accessible. It's information about what's happening in government. So in the UK, we published the salaries of individual senior civil servants with the agreement of the Information Commissioner, who said that for senior officials, the public interest in knowing what they're paid outweighs the private interest in the confidentiality of their pay. And it was found that 172 civil servants were paid more than the Prime Minister. And this was certainly a surprise to the Prime Minister. It was also a surprise to the head of the civil service. And it turned out these were not heads of agencies. They were people like IT directors. And as a result of that, there's been policy change. So an individual agency cannot agree to pay an employee more than the Prime Minister without the agreement of the Minister of Finance. So all those cases are now called in. Is my money being spent well? So government departments and agencies and councils publish all this individual spending data. And a site called Open Spending brings this together and makes it searchable. So if you go there and search on the word ape, another word for monkey, you'll find a number of payments to, or you did in the first year, not so many now, as I'll explain. You'll find a number of payments to a company called Go Ape. Now, who are Go Ape? I mean, we know who Vodafone are, and we know who IBM are, and we know who McDonald's are. But who are Go Ape? So you web search on Go Ape, and you find Go Ape, the UK's #1 treetop adventure. It's in a forest outside London, and you can go there and swing from tree to tree on ropes. And as it says on their website, you can unleash your inner Tarzan. Now, and a number of agencies were sending staff on team building exercises at Go Ape. Now, I'm sure you could sort of justify spending money in that way, but if you're a taxpayer, do you feel your money has been well spent if people have been sent out on courses at Go Ape at your expense? And so publishing this data is not just about combating corruption. It's actually about improving judgments in the public services on what is value for money and what is justifiable use of the taxpayers' money. Publishing data on what contracts are being granted to who, and links to the documents. That's been done in the UK. Some really good work was done by Fair Play Alliance in Slovakia, part funded by the British Embassy there, where the contract documents were published, but just as scanned documents. So Fair Play Alliance actually had a crowdsourced initiative where people could look at documents and extract the key data into a database to make those easy to analyze. Some agencies, particularly parliaments, think they can be transparent but also be not transparent by publishing information as scanned documents. So the expenses of Greek MPs are a classic case on that, where all the information is published, but it is handwritten in Greek. Any parliaments thinking of trying to pretend to be transparent but not being transparent in that way should look at the case of the Argentinian Senate, who had published their expenses in 33,000 PDF documents. The newspaper La Nación in Buenos Aires used crowdsourcing techniques to convert all these documents into analyzable data, and then just ran a series of stories. And each story got a resignation of another senator. So actually, once the data's out there, you can start to work on it. A 16-year-old schoolgirl in the UK thought, well, when civil servants go home at night, do they switch off their lights and their computers? And she noticed there was real-time energy monitoring data available for each half hour for each government headquarters building. So she had the idea of a website that would take this data and plot the electricity usage hour by hour. And as you can see, the Ministry of Defence, at the top of this graph, actually do have a number of lights and computers on at night, and you sort of hope that would be the case, because you don't want to say well, we'll defend the country just during office hours. You expect them to be there at night. The Department of Energy and Climate Change, rightly, they switch a lot off when they go home at night. It's the Ministry of Finance, who are the middle line, who seem to operate 24 hours a day, and I think most public officials wish they didn't. And finally, and this cues up Chris Taggart for this afternoon on open corporates, this sort of open data for transparency is now being applied to the corporate world and to the corporate world globally. And this slide is some very influential work Chris did, which fed into last year's G8, about the ownership patterns of companies and how some multinational companies have hundreds, if not thousands, of subsidiaries. And why are they doing this? It's for their benefit. If they're getting benefit, who is getting the disbenefit? And I think one of the things coming out of the work around the G8 last year, which the UK led, was there's a whole issue now about large companies who turn out not to pay tax anywhere and have very complex ownership structures, so they're not really accountable anywhere. So an initiative being launched to open up this data and open up data, as the UK has announced, on the beneficial ownership of companies as well as the legal ownership. Chris will probably talk more about that later. And there's a fourth unintended result of open data, which is that government can be an open data too, open data user too. Actually, publishing the data makes it easier for other public agencies to find that data. Indeed, it sometimes makes it much easier for people within the same agency to find their data. And so in Greater Manchester, their open data initiative was justified entirely on the savings of their internal efficiencies by being able to find the data that they already had but couldn't find. The EU Inspire Directive, was a study by the Spanish government who had seen the Inspire Directive, which is about publishing details of any geospatial data sets that you hold. It was another burden based on, placed on countries by the European Commission, and yet the Spanish government, when they actually studied what had happened, found that the investment had paid for itself in 6 months because they could now find their own data, which before the Inspire Directive was implemented, they couldn't do. And the Inspire Directive was about other people finding the data, but actually it was about enabling the government themselves to find their own data. So it was actually an 8-to-1 return on investment on the government's account alone, let alone the wider benefits of the intended by the Inspire Directive. And in British Columbia, in Canada, they had an early open data initiative, and they found that the government was the #1 user of the open data they put out there. Actually putting the data out meant the government could find it. So very quickly, some lessons learned along the way, and this is, the UK has now released over 10,500 data sets. It's got an open government license, transparency programs, and 4 versions of the open data site, data.gov.uk. First of all, it's all about leadership inside the organisation and political leadership. Being transparent is not the natural way of public servants. It is countercultural everywhere. And that means about leadership and understanding the wider benefits and why in the modern world, governments need to be more open about things they can be open about so they can be trusted about the things that they can't be so open about. It's about getting the demand side right, recognizing the demand from businesses and citizens for open data and supplying that data. It's focusing on data about things that people care about. As a colleague said, any government can publish boring data that no one wants to see and no one will ever use. If you want the data used, if you want to get the benefits from the data, it needs to be data that people will use. So that's often about requesting data supplying data that people request. And in the UK now, we've published not only 10,500 data sets that are publicly available, but 4,000 data sets that we know we've got that are not yet publicly available. And we've invited people to say which of those we should release as a matter of priority. We're quite interested in the UK on what we call the National Information Infrastructure, which is data like geospatial data, weather data, transport data, administrative boundaries, which we find have been very widely used in the economy and permeate all sorts of services. So it's that type of data that tends to get a very high return on investment. A clear common licensing approach, open means open. The New Zealand government have an open data initiative, but actually only 1/3 of the data that they publish is under an open license. And open means, you've got to allow commercial use as well as non-commercial use. I mean, if you don't allow commercial use, you don't get the economic benefit of the data. And you have to be grown up, adult, about what the data might be used for. So you can't say it can only be used for things that the government approves, which is essentially what the Singapore license says. So the UK, the Open Government License basically says you can use this data for any purpose you like. You can't claim the government's endorsement of your service, obviously, and the government doesn't take any liability for the accuracy of that data. All you have to do is say that you got the data originally from the government, give an acknowledgement of that. You need to make sure the data is reusable, so all those PDFs, if they are MPs' expenses, then people may well delve through them. If they are less interesting and controversial data, it won't get reused. So where the data is available electronically, get it used. Ensure the privacy of personal data. So open data is actually about anonymous data, not data about identifiable individuals. And we've been doing a lot of work in the UK on the science of anonymization, which isn't just about removing the name and address. It's actually understanding what characteristics could be used to use other data to associate with, and then start to identify individuals in that data. Now, this is an area that the statisticians have worked on for many years in things like the census. So, what level of detail do you put out the census? So we're building on that experience. Every agency has concerns about opening their data, and you've got to work through those. Often I find that just combating the particular reason doesn't answer the question. because many officials think we've never published this data before. There must be a good reason why we've never published it. We don't know what the reason was, so we will think up a plausible reason. So if you then sort of show that the plausible reason is not a valid reason, they think of another reason. So it's a matter about selling the benefits of open data and getting benefits to public policy on that. It's about incremental delivery. It won't all be done at once. The very first version of data.gov.uk had 1,189 data sets on it, which is about 1,000 more than I expected, because we found an existing collection of 1,000 data sets that we could just put into the open space. But now there are 10 times that amount of data and more to go. It's about promoting the use of open data. We've done a lot on that by showcasing applications as well as the data through competitions, through developer engagement, engaging with the developers all the time, including, on the bottom right-hand side here, a group known as Young Rewired State, which is basically a summer camp for children to use government data to do interesting and innovative things with. And that was where the 16-year-old schoolgirl came up with the government departments turn off their lights at night. And finally, building what we're starting to call the open data ecosystem. It's not just sort of governments and developers. There are all sorts of other actors in this. So it's things like software packages like CCAN, which is a software package used by the UK, the US, and many other governments to manage their open data catalogs and make those accessible. It's open source, it's available to everyone. Data Publica in France, a commercial company who specialize in being able to find and organize data about France. The School of Data, which is part sponsored by the Open Knowledge Foundation, is about training in skills in using data and skills in publishing open data. And the Open Data Institute, which the UK government has set up, but is increasingly a sort of international presence on incubating startups in open data and promoting the economic use of open data. And final message, the lesson from the British experience on open data was if we'd tried to start with an open data policy, we'd still be arguing about it today. The approach has been to overcome obstacles practically by doing something, by publishing some data, by getting that data used, and then more data emerged and more people understood what the government was trying to do. There's better understanding of it within government. There's peer pressure within government to start opening up data, and more got released. It's a practical issue, not a theoretical one. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.